Everybody. Welcome to EGX. Thank you to the EGX organizers for inviting me here. It's a lot of fun for me to come out and talk to people and have captives in the room that have to listen to my insane narrative theories. What I want to discuss today is genre, and what genre means in video games and what genre means in other media, and how we use the word and how the word is defined, and why it's really important, I think, to know what you're doing when you use the word genre, and how that affects game design, how that affects narrative, et cetera, et cetera. So first, who am I? That's not me. There's a lot of artwork from our games in here, because I think we have great artwork. So it's random artwork on the screen, and then I will talk. So I'm the narrative director of Amplitude Studios, one of the co-founders, so I've been with them from the beginning. And from the beginning, we've been developing the universe, writing the games, all that kind of thing. It's been a great 7.5 years now. So there are a lot of different ways to speak about genre, and there's a lot of different things we mean when we use the word genre. And the reason that I think it's really important and why we should care about it, there's basically 3 reasons. First one is when a player or a reader or a viewer, depending on what you're creating, sees a trailer or sees an ad on a website or sees a billboard in the metro, they make assumptions about what the product is you're making, about what you've created, and about the experience they're going to have. And that affects their reaction to it while they're playing, while they're reading, while they're watching. And assuming a genre and exploiting, I would say, a genre also gives you a lot of, well, I suppose you call them tropes, but because I like to pretend I'm intellectual, I use more syllables and call it narrative shorthand. But basically, genres have tropes associated with them, and those are very, very strong. And I'll get into that. And so these are the reasons why I think it's surprisingly important to know when we talk about genre what it means. So the first thing is the contract. Basically, you've made a promise to the player. The player sees a video, the player sees a let's play, the player sees a trailer, and they have an assumption about the experience they're going to have. And they pick that up from signals that might be explicit or implicit in the trailer, but they assume that they are ready, that they assume that they're going to have a certain style, a certain setting, a certain type of gameplay. And all of that together is this sort of implicit contract that as a dev or as a writer, as an animator, you've made with the consumer, with the customer. And we don't often think about that. And we don't often think about, when we're doing artwork or when we're writing, what the assumptions of the consumer might be and how they're viewing well, I would say, piece of art that we're working on. And the issue about the contract and then the immersion is that genres have rules. They really actually do. Now, we like to play with the rules and play with genres and subvert genres because that's a lot of fun. But that can be dangerous because when you start breaking the genre rules, you're breaking this contract you set up with the player, with the reader, with the viewer. Quick example I just thought up. I'm sure there's a lot of better ones you guys could think of. A private eye, classic private eye movie, game, film, that's noir. That's noir detective. You know, it's dark people with dark pasts doing dark things because deep down inside they're really good and they still get crushed at the end, but that goodness stays in. You know, that whole kind of thing. Noir can have humor, right? They can have moments of wry humor, but it's not comedy just because there's humor in it. So if you want to do funny noir, you better sell that as funny and not as noir. Does that make sense? So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about when we discuss genre and we present genre. So the third thing is the narrative shorthand. It is incredible how powerful tropes are. And you're just gonna give me a couple of examples, okay? I'm gonna shoot an image or a picture on the screen, and I want you guys just to speak up what the game genre is, what the narrative is like, what it's about, all that kind of thing. Okay, here's the first one. Sorry, here's the first one. All right, what is it? Yeah, and so what genre do you see the trilby, the fedora? Yeah, see, that's an easy one. That's a detective noir, right? So, okay, here's another one. Yeah, we had an issue with the fonts that said Blaster. My bad. So, Blaster, what does that mean? It's sci-fi. Okay, what's the gameplay? Right. What's the setting? The setting's sci-fi. It's a shooter gameplay. You can probably guess the storylines. You can sort of assume the kind of thing you're in. Okay, what's that game? Yeah, right? So the hero is grizzled white guy, dark past probably. What's the gameplay? Max Payne, there's one, right? Action adventure, maybe some exploration, shooting the bad guys, right? All right, what's this game? Yeah, so what's the gameplay? Anyway, you get the idea, right? And this, what's this? Yeah, it's a zombie killer, right? So, see, the thing is, that's how strong tropes are. And that's how strong genre images and genre, this is going to be a lot easier, concepts are. And that's the kind of thing that when you start developing a game, when you start marketing a game, these signals get picked up like that, and these expectations get set like that. But I still have a problem with genres in the game world because you see all these different. Sorry, I started playing with the animations because I got really bored about just the fade in. So you have all. That's cool. You have all these different genres, right? And the thing is, now we're talking about genre, and it's like, well, it's kind of game mechanic, but sports and strategy and simulation are kind of. I mean, this comes right out of Wikipedia, right? This is when people talk about genre, they talk about these things, but the lines aren't that clear between them. And if we keep talking about it, then we have sad opbot, because you don't just have these. Then you start getting all these. Look at this. Look at this animation. You start getting all these other different, right? And so game genre starts to mean a whole lot of different things. And it doesn't come down to a useful idea that like a narrative person can work with, or maybe even a designer can work with. And it's certainly not necessarily a clear signal to the consumer, except for just a little part of the experience. And we're talking about the whole gameplay experience. So then I said, okay, what about genres you see in a bookstore, right? Maybe that'll be easier and clearer. But here we go again. Sadly, it's all over the place. I mean, you can mix and match. Maybe it's an inspirational teen romance with some paranormal in it, right? Or maybe it's so. I'm finding that typically when we speak of genre, it's used in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different assumptions from a lot of different points of view. And maybe the worst thing we do is when we actually mean setting, we say genre. Right? Those are settings. I mean, you can pick any setting. You take science fantasy, and you can do a paranormal, multicultural horror in science fantasy. Right? So it's kind of a genre, but it's really setting. So that, and that's maybe good for the artwork, but it's not helpful, I think, either when you're trying to send a message or when you're talking to a dev team trying to move forward on a game design. So I started looking at it from a different point of view. I said, okay, let's take the narrative, because that's my job. What do you do when you create a narrative? Well, you do what you had to do in high school, right? You take the classic elements of prose narrative. I'm having a lot of fun clicking this thing. Right? And that's basically, there we are, what you start with, right? And you build a story from this. You can build any story from this, but when you start looking at that, that's actually different. Each one of those blocks is going to vary a bit depending on which genre you're building for, right? The point of view is going to be different. Setting's certainly going to be different. The theme will certainly be different, right? All these things start to become more clearly defined, right? Like, these are sort of the Lego blocks from which you build something more coherent. And so I came across this idea, and I liked it, but then I thought, we're also designing games here. So do the same thing, right? What are the basic building blocks when you're designing a game? Sorry, is it me or is this going to now? Right? You can break it down the same kind of way to a basic set of elements. I don't know, I'm looking for a better word here. Shout it out if you think of it. For creating that. And then this led me, arguing a lot with myself, to the idea of Jeff's unified theory of game and narrative mechanics. You can probably guess it by now. But basically, if you take something, what is camera in a game? Well, from the literary point of view, that's point of view. Sorry, I didn't phrase that well. All right. actions and verbs. You take the actions and verbs you design in a game, and what does that determine narratively? Well, for me, that's characters more than anything else. What you can do in a game is kind of who's doing it, right? I mean, if you're running around lost in the woods, that's one kind of character. If you're blowing up fortresses with spells, that's another kind of character. If you're doing a platformer to find the princess, that's another kind of character. And so for me, a lot of what action and verb in a game is ties to the narrative idea of character. And if we keep going, the challenge for me, that's plot pacing, right? How tough is it? How quickly does it go? What are the bosses like? How do you step that difficulty level? That gives you your plot and your pacing for the narrative elements. Resources. What is the player managing when they're going through your game? Are they managing time? Is it bullets? Is it mana? Is it mana crystals? Is it oxygen? Right? There's a resource in there that's critical to the player to get through your game. And for me, you might say art for this, but I think that really determines your setting, right? That has to be very close to your setting, what the resources are that you're using in the game. Then there's the art and the environment, of course, and most people would say that's setting, but I think that's where a lot of the theme comes through. Because if you take something like science fiction could be Dead Space, it could be Alien Isolation, it could be a Star Wars game, it could be one of our space operas. And that, I think, really comes through a lot in the art and the environment. You know, this idea of environmental storytelling. Well, what the player is seeing as they move through your game has a very, very strong impact on the mood and the style of the game. So now, if we take these bits and we come back to genre, and we see that different genres use different approaches to deal with this. So if you just take one of those, I'm not going to go through all those, and look at point of view, right? In prose, you basically have first person, close third person, and third person omniscient. If these words ring a bell, I had to sort of look them up again because I was a little rusty. First person, basically, you think of like the classic noir PI, where you don't see anyone else's thoughts. You're in the protagonist's mind, and you see what they see, but you don't see anything else. That's the very classic noir point of view. Third person tight would be maybe you hear what the person's thinking, but it's probably, it's like Jane is doing this. So you're not inside Jane's head, but you're probably being told what Jane is thinking. On the other hand, you might know what's behind the door. Whereas if it's a PI story, you don't. You know all the assumptions, what he thinks is behind the door. Then the door opens, and then you find out the truth. If you're doing a thriller or horror game, maybe you want to know, maybe you want the player or viewer to know what's behind the door when Jane doesn't. Because that's you get that tension, that horror, that, oh no, right? That whole thing. And then there's a third person omniscient, where you sort of know everything that's going on more or less. And you're seeing all the different pieces, the groups, the characters, how they're opposing each other, and sort of watching the puzzle play out. Now, you can do the same thing, of course, in a game. First person, classic, it's the shooter, right? All you see is like your hands here with the chainsaw or whatever you happen to have. Third person tight would be an action game where you sort of third person over the shoulder camera, action adventure, Horizon Zero Dawn, one of the Clancy games, something like that. And then third person omniscient, what we do, strategy games. And I think it's already, well, for me, I was going to say interesting, but you can come to your own conclusion. Because I'm already seeing, when I started putting this together, that what I view as a first person story is maybe not necessarily viewed as a first person story from the point of view of game design. So if you're thinking about genres and what the player is going to assume and what the player is expecting, this is already a thing to think about. Where are you making the trade-off, right? Are you going to be slightly out of step with the classic narrative style of this literary genre because you have to, because you're making a game? And ultimately, everything takes a backseat to the game design because that's what people are buying. But it's good to maybe think about when you're breaking that contract or just bending it a bit, enforcing the fine print, whatever you want to call it. Now, taking all this to what Amplitude does, I'm trying to rush through this, I hope. Yeah. So we think about this stuff a lot when we're developing our games, even though we're just doing 4X strategy. And the reason for that is that if you guys played either Endless Legend or Endless Space, you guys know the games a bit. What we try to do is have give every faction a really unique gameplay. so that when you're coming and playing, you play through with every game will have a plain vanilla faction. The basic humans, you go through, you learn the mechanics, that's great. Then you pick somebody else, and it's going to be different. There's going to be a resource you can't use. There's going to be another technique you can use in the game that no other faction can, that sort of changes how you approach things. What that means for me is that every faction is therefore a little bit of a different genre, because you're playing a little bit of a different game. And when we write the quest lines for these factions, we can actually write them in different genres. So we're actually trying to apply different genre tropes within our 4X strategy game, depending on the faction you're playing. I think I've lost a lot of people already. I apologize for that. And then there's Dungeon of the Endless, which is like its own bizarre thing off in a corner. I'll talk a little bit about that maybe. So, for instance, if you guys played The Forgotten in our Endless Legend, one of our Endless Legend expansions, their quest, it's a pure, basically one of the designers came to us. Ben came to us and said, guys, I want to do basically Kill Bill in a fantasy game. So it's a vengeance quest. There's 3 heroes you got to go and find and kill. It's straightforward. It's action, very simple, told from a first person. It's a very tight third-person point of view. So we did that in the game. And then there's the Morgar, which is another extension to Legend, except it's told in first-person plural, because it's sort of a hive mind coming out of the sea. And it's actually a coming-of-age story. It's kind of gruesome because they're paranoid and psychotic, but they're just growing up and learning what's out there in the world and coming to terms with it and trying to find their place. It is a coming-of-age story. It just happens to be about demons from the sea. United Empire in Endless Space was a straight mystery story. You're the emperor, there's a rebellion, you got to stamp it out. Who did it? Who betrayed me? That kind of thing. You're going through a classic, more or less, pretty tight first person. It is written in first person. Steve wrote that one. I didn't. That's why I hesitated. I think it's a great quest. Anyway, Lumeris, those are the mafiosi, right? So when we wrote their story, the Roman came and said, you know what, these guys should do Scarface. Godfather, Scarface. Their families, their mafiosi. You have the young upstart, the trouble he causes, the fact that he gets taken care of one way or the other in the end. So we got to do this sort of like classic action mafia-style adventure game. The Wild Walkers was a classic quest game. They're like a very classic, they're sort of the elven faction, so we gave them sort of a high fantasy quest kind of thing to do. So we get to play with all these different genres. And we think about it when we do the artwork in the game for the quest, when we write the lines for the quest, the point of view we use for the characters. We try to take this into account. We try to sell the quest a certain way and sell the faction a certain way, so that the player knows what they're getting, and then we deliver it. And then there's Dungeon of the Endless, which is basically, it's this prison ship that crashes, and there's crew, and there's prisoners, and there's the locals who are inhabiting the dungeons already, and they all mix together, and they all have individual stories, but only if you get them together in the elevator between the levels, the pieces of the story start coming out. So you have to play a heck of a lot of the game to even get like maybe one of the stories complete, and it's kind of very bizarre design, but then there's a meta story behind the whole thing. And that's a very different, that's more of like, that's like deconstructionist modern literature or something. I wouldn't really compare that to any useful genre. But that's what we did there. And we often get questions about it, so I thought I'd put it up there. So the question is, well, what kind of game are you making? And so from my point of view, talking about this whole genre thing, there's 3 things. There's the game genres. There's the mechanics, right? You have the fedora hat, or you have the blaster, right? What are the mechanics you're playing with? That's one element of genre. There's the dramatic genre, right? What's the story the player is going to live, right? You tie the mechanics and the story together for the experience. So those 2 are important together. And then, of course, the setting, right? Because you can do the Expanse, which has an element of the private eye genre. The guy has the fedora, but he's on a spaceship. Yeah, you can do that, right? You set that up. You set the tropes up. And you go through with it that way, because that's what the player, that's the contract you've made. That's what they're expecting. So here's one. Actually, I already mentioned it, so it's not going to be that hard. The game mechanics is action-adventure, a little bit of stealth in it. It's mystery. You might have called it exploration. It's basically mystery, and the setting is sci-fi horror. The game is... Yeah, okay. It hasn't been Alien Isolation is what I was thinking of, right? Because you can take a game, and I think if you use a few blocks like this, if you go back to the elements of writing, the elements of game design, and the setting, and the setting. You actually can come up with genre definitions that make sense for the dev team that can be clearly communicated to the viewer or the reader or the player who's going to buy your product. And to me, that's a much healthier way and a much clearer way, both for the development team and for the marketing team, and ultimately for the player or the reader or the viewer to understand what your product is, how you're doing it. And it also gives you guidelines so you don't lose your way during the dev process. So I just think, yeah, obviously I'm obsessed with this, and I've thought a lot about it. So anyway, thank you for listening. That's it. That's all I wanted to say about genre and games and narrative and that sort of thing. So if you guys have any comments or questions, I would love to hear them.
When is mixing genres overkill? Like, when will it be overkill?
Yeah, that kind of depends on your audience. I mean, if you're going in and you're pitching investors for money, your genre description might be related, to the classic. It's Battlefield, but with spitballs in a classroom or something. Or you might try to define the genre that way. But basically, you can get into overkill, and you can get to the point of where you're actually giving away your plot line if you go into too much detail. Because if you describe a setting and game mechanics, and then you explain that it's tragedy, or romance, people are going to sort of know what the end is already. Right? Tragedy, they die. Romance, they marry. So I mean, you have to be careful about how far you go. But I think you can do a lot of both in art and with text, or in a game demo, show a lot of what the promise is without giving away the key points of the plot or the really exciting moments in gameplay that you don't want to show for whatever reason. But it's very much project to project.
In the front row, 1, 2.
Verbal abuse is also okay if there's no questions.
First of all, I want to apologise. I've been here since 9 in the morning. I've just been for a pint, so I was nodding off a little bit, and that's nothing to do with you. That's to do with the alcohol. So
I'll speak louder next time. Okay.
But this question isn't directly tied to the genre. I know some of the experience in the industry. I've had an education in game design with the Swedish university. Now I'm going into becoming a 3D artist. I'm wondering, because I have got that design edge and I do enjoy it, if I were to go into the industry as an artist, is it hard to kind of have an input with designers in terms of the design for a project kind of thing, or are you kind of pushed aside and you're seen as more of a tool for their ideas, or would you see that someone who's an artist could maybe have an input?
I'm going to be honest, okay? Basically, cinema is the realm of the director, right? They're the god. They control things. Writing, it's the writer. You're creating a novel. Honestly, in games, it's the designer, right? The lead designer, the lead creative person, when that design will be under there, they really call the shots. So now, as an artist with a design background, right, you will be listened to more than an artist without a design background. But in my experience, it's very clear, and it makes sense, that the designers really call the shots in a game dev project. The advantage you have is that you do a piece of art and it shows this really cool thing. Yeah, I want to have blasters, and you go, yeah, but I put this vehicle in there. It's kind of cool. Do you want to have it? Maybe we should do some vehicle action in there. And they're like, well, we weren't planning for that, but that, I mean, you can throw ideas in, because we use artists a lot in our brainstorming sessions, and it can't hurt. It can't hurt, but don't expect automatically and from the beginning to be listened to. That's what I would say. So yeah, more general questions too, if. My styling T-shirt, the He Show.
Any more?
Okay. Anybody else? Comments? No? Okay. Well, thanks very much for listening.
Cool. Thank you.